Hey everyone, it's Chris Carter here from the Locked On Steelers podcast. Today we've got Nick Farabaugh from PennLive.com. We want to talk about the big news in the AFC North, and that's Tee Higgins being franchise tagged. While that's not a surprise, it now takes that off the board as something the Steelers can chase after, and now we get a closer look at what the Steelers could actually do at wide receiver. That, answering your mailbag questions, and our final grades of the season, special teams, all here on today's podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. As I said before, we're joined by the man himself, Nick Farabaugh. He's back. We love him. You know him. He is from PennLive.com. Their Steelers beat reporter there. Nick is on the road. He's handling some other business right now. But Nick, some obvious news that's not like shocking, but it still is big news that they finally did it. The Bengals put their franchise tag reportedly on Tee Higgins. They're also pursuing, there's also reports from Jeremy Fowler at ESPN saying that they're trying to make sure that they actually sign him, Trey Hendrickson, and Jamar Chase long-term. Now, I don't know about all of that, but the franchise tag going on Tee Higgins takes him off the board for the Steelers. There's no way the Bengals would ever trade him to Pittsburgh, and now the Steelers fans can kind of get that off of their periphery as being a possibility. But what do you see now that he's officially off the board and people don't have to worry about him in free agency? Who becomes that gem in the free agency pool at wide receiver that people might chase after a little harder?
I mean, I don't know if there's a Tee Higgins out there. I guess, I think Chris Godwin is a pretty big gem. I know he's coming off the ankle injury, but he was going into a career year before the injury. I think he's a big name. I think the moment Davante Adams gets cut, I know he's 32, but he's still playing like a top wide receiver in this league. I think Adams is going to have a lot of suitors for his bidding. I mean, 14 games this year, still put up over 1,000 yards at age 32. The Jets sucked, but Davante Adams did not suck. That is a very good thing there. And so I think those two guys are probably the top of the market. And then you kind of filter in anybody else. It's a deep group, man. I mean, look at it. You got the Deebo Samuels, the Cooper Kupps, you have Amari Cooper, you have Stephon Diggs, you have Darius Slayton, you have a ton of names out there this year. And I think all those guys that I listed outside of Adams and Godwin kind of have significant questions. And even Godwin has a question of the ankle injury, but it is a deeper group. You might not find the game changer that Higgins would be, but I think you can find solid play. And I will say, I don't think people are going to kind of realize how big of a difference just solid play at the 2 spot will be for the Steelers. They got nothing out of their wide receiver 2 spot this year. And so that wide receiver 2 outside spot, even just getting solid play out of that guy, that'll mean a lot for the offense.
Yeah, I mean, it just gives you an actual threat on that side of the ball that can scare opponents. And if they don't pay attention to them, it gives the quarterback something else to target there. And I think that's what the Steelers have to be looking for here, right? Is, whoever's going to be their guy, they can be that. Now, you and I have also talked about, because, there's also guys like Darius Slayton who could be very affordable out there in the free agent market that would be kind of like that. But you and I have also talked about the potential of this team trading for a wide receiver. Is that something that you still see as a very decent chance of happening, or at least a decent chance of the Steelers taking a hard look at? Or is that just a lot of smoke and the Steelers are just making some noise there?
No, they're absolutely going to look at it. They tried to last year, right? They tried to do it all the time last year. They tried to trade for Cooper Kupp last year. They called the deadline. They didn't get the answer they're getting now. They tried to trade for Deebo Samuel last offseason. Like both these guys that we're talking about, the Steelers literally called and tried to trade for. It's not lunacy, right? It's not the Trevor Lawrence rumors. This is a different thing. The Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp stuff, there's probably teeth to it. And listen, I think, you and I, Chris, we both kind of talked about it. I think we both have questions about both those guys, right?
Yeah.
I think if, another guy that's probably going to get cut or traded is Christian Kirk. Steelers work close again. That's another guy. They probably would have traded for him if he didn't break his collarbone. He's got questions, but, all these guys in this wide receiver market are interesting. But I think the trade market is definitely lush too. What if, there's a few other guys that I know have been thrown around. Could a Tyler Lockett become available? Could a DK Metcalf become available, Cortland Sutton, someone like that. Sometimes there's surprise guys. I don't think anyone went into last offseason thinking Keenan Allen and Diggs were going to get traded, and they did. And so sometimes there's surprise players that also get popped up into this conversation. So we'll see. I think the trade market combined with the free agency market is pretty lush. I know that there is questions around a lot of these veterans where you're like, he might not be the guy that he once was, but a lot of these players are still really solid football players, and the Steelers just need upgrades across from George Pickens. They need a threat, and they need players. They need talent, and those guys can add talent to the room. And so I have questions about a lot of these guys. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but I definitely think the Steelers can find upgrades here to at least kind of help boost the room a little bit.
No, I feel you on that, and I think that's part of what the Steelers are looking for is the upgrade. But let me ask you a broader question, bigger than just wide receiver. Tee Higgins, I would say, if he was in free agency, he would have been the biggest free agent name. Like everyone else would have waited to see what happened with him. Now that he is gone, if you're the Steelers, maybe not just the whole NFL, because that's a different story, but if you're the Steelers right now, and right now they got $53 million in cap space, they can jump that up to 70 with not a whole lot of hard effort to do so. If you're the Steelers, who is the one player in free agency that you're like, you are going to score if you get this guy, of course, at a reasonable price, not like, paying, but even if you did pay a big price for him, is there one player that you're like, this needs to be the priority above all others now that Tee Higgins is officially off the board?
It's an interesting question. I mean, there are a few players I can pound the table for. I'd pound the table for Godwin or Adams. Those two, I think, are really big targets. I think you can look at the corners, really, and start to pound the table for DJ Reed, someone
Byron
like
Murphy.
That. Yeah, Byron Murphy.
I like him a lot.
I like both those players a lot. I really love this corner free agency group, period. I love the crop. I think you can get, if you're talking about the slots, you can get Asante Samuel Jr. Kendall Fuller just got cut. You can get Nate Hobbs from the Raiders, who's a nice player. There's so many good slots, and then you can kind of put a really talented outside corner there, and you can get a DJ Reed. You can get Byron Murphy. You can get someone like that. So Shavarius Ward. There's just so many good corners. I think corner becomes one. I also would like to see them make a run at Milton Williams. I know that we talk about defensive line. I know it's super deep in the draft, but I'm a really big Milton Williams fan as well. So, I wouldn't hate making a run there either. But I think when you look at the kind of positions to search, corner, I think you can make a big splash at, and I think you can make an equally big splash at wide receiver if you can land one of those two guys. I expect the splash at receiver to be a little – I think people, if you put your expectations to the Tee Higgins sky, if your three are Higgins, Godwin, and Adams no matter what, and you want a true one, I think you might be disappointed. I think they're going to get a 2, 3. They might get two guys there, but I don't think we're going to see them land, a 1. I think Godwin is probably heading back to Tampa. I think that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And we'll see. I think Devontae Adams is probably more realistic than people will give it credit for, but we'll kind of see what he wants. I know there's a report out there that he wants to go to the West Coast. So we'll kind of see what happens there. But I do think you have a lot of big fish out there that you can get at receiver, corner, and I think even defensive line has a little bit of big fish available if you want to go there.
Keep that name that you said, Milton Williams, on your brain, because I want to come back to him in a future segment later in this show, because he and one other player that's a free agent for that position at defensive tackle, those are two guys I want to talk about with the question we got in the mailbag. We got other questions in the mailbag. We'll get to those next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter with Nick Farabaugh. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the number one sportsbook in America. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just beginning on FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. That's because FanDuel is your home for NBA live betting. So even if you missed the first few minutes of the game and want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can make your picks from the first whistle until the final buzzer. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. However you want to play, now is the perfect time to join. Now, FanDuel customers can get started with $150 in bonus bets in your first bet if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your one shot at $150, in bonus bets if you hit on your first bet of $5 or more. Make everyone more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Nick Farabaugh on. Before we take your calls, because we do have our call-in line we're going to get to, I do want to do a quick roundup of the final two players on the team who we have not given final grades for, and that are our special team guys for the Steelers, Chris Boswell and Corliss Waitman. Waitman on the year, 15 stars throughout the season, only one skull. That's good enough for a B-plus grade on the season. Filled in really well for Cameron Johnston, who honestly looked like he was going to have a big year with the way he was punting in preseason and in training camp. But a heck of a year for Corliss Waitman. And what else can be said about Chris Boswell other than he was an A-plus player? He had 23 stars to just one skull here. Nick, Boswell, I think, cements himself as the best kicker in the NFL. Justin Tucker going through a lot of other issues right now. But that is a really good spot for him to be in. And Corliss Waitman coming through, this might be the best situation they've had at combined punting and kicking in a while.
No, very long time punter.
Very long time.
Very long time. I mean, what can you say about Boz? He saves them so many times when they don't get three. He makes so many 50-yard field goals. Set the franchise record for most field goals made in a season. I mean, super consistent, great kicker. I agree. I think he's the best in the NFL right now. And so he deserves an A+. Waitman at a B+ probably sounds about right. He had a few shaky ones, but I'll tell you what, I actually really appreciated having a lefty punter. I know that's something that Bill Belichick really loved having, was a lefty punter, because the spin came off a different. I don't have the stats, but I would guess the most muff punts this year. The Steelers may have had that, because how many opponents did we see this year muff punts? Steelers didn't throw them, but there were a lot of opponents that just muff punts. And I know, talking to some of his returners, I know when I talked to Calvin Austin and that, when he said you were catching, Corliss Waitman's balls, it was just different because it comes off at a different, twist. It's a little different angle. So it's tough to prepare for. So I think that's a little added bonus to having a lefty punter if you're really good. And Corliss Waitman, I mean, if he doesn't end up being their punter next year, we'll see who ends up being their punter. I mean, he should usually have a job somewhere, and he's been easily. So he earned himself, I think, his NFL keep.
I think so too. Let's move it along here. Don't need to spend too long on special teams there, but let's get to your calls here. As always, you can call into the Locked On Steelers podcast. Get your question on the show by calling 412-223-6644. When you call, leave your name, where you're from, keep your question under a minute. Our first caller calls about George Pickens. It's Jason Weller from Bartow, PA. Jason, take it away.
Hey, Chris Carter. Jason Weller here in Bartow, Pennsylvania. Just want to say I love your show. Keep up the great work. Never miss an episode. Anyways, I wanted to talk about George Pickens. With what is going to happen with him, and my thought is he isn't going to instantly change and not be a bad attitude guy. So I feel like the best thing would be to trade him away, as long as, they target someone in free agency and target one or two guys in the draft. With that said, what are your thoughts on waiting to trade him, trying to get a high pick for next year's draft, and then using that pick to move up to get your quarterback of the future in a class that's going to be a lot better than it is this year? Thank you. Look forward to hearing your response. Bye.
Thank you, Jason, for your call. As always, 412-223-6644 to get your question on the show. Leave your name, where you're from. Keep your question under a minute. That's an interesting question there, Nick, because when I've been thinking of if they're offloading George Pickens, they got to get return that hits now. And I've envisioned hey, you trade for a second-round pick this year. You try to get something like that can lead you to get a rookie, or you use that to get capital to trade up and get a better guy in the first round, something along those lines. But what do you say about the idea of using Pickens to get ammunition for next year's draft so that can be the draft that you go up and get your guy? Because as we were talking about, the Steelers free agent market, it's looking like they're most likely just going to have to settle for getting wide receiver twos. George Pickens is their only wide receiver one on the roster right now, and that could leave you a little bit more barren than you were even last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thought. I do think it's not a bad idea to try and get that 26 second. If you can, you might get a 25 third, but if you can get a 26 second, I think I'd take the second. I think, when you're talking about going up the board to get a quarterback and where the Steelers are probably going to pick, I think we should all expect the Steelers to pick between 18 and 24-ish, probably, right? Give or take. I mean, you're going to have to give up a significant amount of draft capital to go up and get there. And remember, the last time the Steelers did go up 10 spots, they had the Antonio Brown picks. That's the last time they went up that far. So I don't think it's a bad idea. If you're going to trade George Pickens, I wouldn't hate focusing on 2026 because to me, I think if you're trading George Pickens, I think you're hurting your win now mentality regardless, right? You can't – I don't think as we talk through these kind of wide receiver options, I think it's very hard to rebuild the wide receiver room in one offseason if you're offloading George Pickens. I just think it is. Now they could, but I think almost – and the reason I kind of have trouble trading George Pickens, I understand the rationale behind it, but okay, maybe you trade for a Deebo Samuel, then you kind of have to draft Matthew Golden, like Emeka Egbuka or Luther Burton to me. I think you kind of lock yourself in a wide receiver at 21. I don't love that, especially with the D-line class that, is in this one. I would love to have the flexibility to take Derek Harmon or Kenneth Grant or Walter Nolan, whoever you like of those guys. So I do think there's complications with it, but if you're going to trade them, I think the idea of focusing on 2026 and actually having that future in mind, considering where the team is at, especially if you trade George Pickens, it's kind of smart. I kind of like the idea.
It's an interesting idea for sure. It's something I wasn't considering as much because again, I was thinking trying to get return, for this season and trying to figure that out. But to your point, Nick, like the big thing is that the Steelers need to be able to go get that quarterback when they're ready to go get that quarterback. I think it's also interesting to talk about, will that quarterback be there? Because because there's no guarantee that next year's quarterback class is amazing. There's always guys who hold back a year. There's always guys who, don't pan out as well the next year. There's also guys who turn up and they become the superstar. So like people didn't know Jane Daniels was going to be this good, before senior season. People didn't know Joe Burrow was going to be as good as he was, when he was coming out. So, I think that there's merit to that idea and preparing for that. But I also think that if the Steelers get rid of George Pickens, they need to have a follow-up move in mind. Like when they got rid of Kenny Pickett, not that Kenny Pickett is George Pickens, they went and got Justin Fields. Like that was a comparable move to be like, hey, here's this guy that didn't work out as a franchise quarterback who we can now bring into our ranks. He's also young and he has traits that we can work with and develop. Similarly, if they get rid of George Pickens, they have to go out and get somebody else in return. Like this cannot be we tried and now you got nobody. That could be a disaster. I think I talked with Alan about this, maybe not you. I feel like if they go and get Deebo Samuel, that's fine. Deebo Samuel needs to be part of a pair of moves. And if George Pickens is gone, maybe a trio of moves at wide receiver. And that's why I think it's a tricky thing about trading him. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, because I do think that George Pickens needs to grow up. Mike Tomlin's acknowledged it. Art Rooney's acknowledged it. And I think the only person that hasn't acknowledged it is George Pickens. And that's where you want him. And because again, it's the challenge of, do you pay him long-term? And if you do, that means you're saying that you're signing on for this. Or 2, do you try to trade him away? Or 3, do you try to let him play on his last year of his rookie deal? And then you either are risking him holding in or holding out at the start of training camp. And then you're risking also maybe needing to franchise tag him and getting into the space where the Bengals are with Tee Higgins right now.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? I also think, you have to consider when we're talking about the Steelers this offseason, I think people talk about the immediate need at wide receiver, and there absolutely is an immediate need at wide receiver.
Yeah.
There's a huge future need at wide receiver. Even if they get Deebo Samuel and he turns out to be quite good and he's a free agent next year.
Yep.
But then you also look at it and you say Calvin Austin's a free agent next year. The only guy under contract next season in that room is Roman Wilson. They need a young player regardless. And so I think no matter what happens, I think even if they get a Godwin, even if they get a Devontae Adams, a draft pick has to be a priority. A day 2 or earlier draft pick at that position is a massive future need for them, especially if you're talking about getting a young quarterback. You want to QB-proof your offense. I think that's the biggest thing when we talk about quarterback coming in. What's the best way to get that quarterback ready to go and get that quarterback so comfortable? You QB-proof it. You give him a good offensive line. You give him weapons. You give him a play caller that knows what he's doing. The Steelers have to start that process. They started a little bit last year when they got all those O-linemen. They got Faltano, Frazier, McCormick. This year, it's going to be focused on the weapons. And so receiver is going to be a tough balance. The Steelers are probably going to make 2 or 3 moves at that position regardless of what happens. If it's Deebo Samuel, you can pair it with Darius Slayton. You could pair it with someone like that. You can get two. You can get a 2 and a 3. Round that out. You put in Calvin Austin, a rookie, Roman Wilson. It's not a bad room, right? It's a solid room that you have there. So I do think the Steelers, if they trade George Pickens, just put themselves into dire straits. They not only probably have to make 2 free agent signings at that point. Again, I think personally, if I traded George Pickens, I would feel as Omar Khan that I would have to take Burden, Egbuka, or Golden at 21. That's just what
I feel you because then you need a wide receiver one, especially in today's NFL. And I know the Steelers have been, trying to become that more physical team, but I feel like George Pickens has given them the flexibility to say, hey, we got this really talented guy here. If we can hit on some role guys behind him, that'd be fine. If you trade away George Pickens, you need to go have that guy in mind. And with a reasonable way of getting him. And I'm just not so sure that they have that guy lined up for them right now. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to get to another question here that I think very much touches into why I've been hyping on defensive tackles, but in the draft class, but also touches into in the overall construction of the roster. We'll talk about that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Nick Farabaugh, stick with us. We'll be right back. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Nick Farabaugh, talking all things Steelers here, taking your questions here on the Locked On Steelers call-in line. This one comes from Doug Phillips out in Plum, Pennsylvania. Doug, take it away.
Hi, Chris. This is Doug Phillips from Plum. I was just wondering how Mike Tomlin, who had Dick LeBeau as his defensive coordinator one time, can be happy with what he's seen going on in the field out of his defense. Plus, I know the loss of Stephon Tuitt has been felt for a couple of years, but this year has really reared its ugly head on the loss of him. I just don't know when they'll be able to recover. And I thank you for taking my call.
Thank you, Doug, for calling. As always, you can call like Doug did and like Jason did for this show, 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from. Keep your question under a minute. Nick, I have said for years that the impact of losing Stephon Tuitt is one of the most understated things that the Steelers have gone through, because that was a double-digit sack guy in the interior. He was one of the best interior pass rushers in the NFL. The very thing that the Eagles are using right now to dominate, the very thing that the Chiefs were using when their pass rush was getting after it, and him and Cam Hayward with Keanu Benton right now would be if Tuitt was continued on the rise that he was experiencing towards the end of his career before he retired. There was a potential there for true dominance at defensive tackle. And when he retired, they went out and got Larry Ogunjobi. Larry Ogunjobi was very much just that, hey, we're gonna plug this guy in here. He's a veteran and hope he can work out. He was solid, I gave him like a C+ on the year. But when you're paying the guy as much as Larry Ogunjobi, you need more than solid. You need playmaking, and that's where the Steelers were. It was supposed to be a strength for them. And I wanted to ask you, how much does that impact the overall plans right now? Is still trying to find that guy that can be Stephon Tuitt for this roster?
Yeah, Tuitt would only be 31. I mean, he would still be in basically a prime part of his career. And not only this, they planned to have Tuitt and Hayward there for a long time because they let Javon Hargrave walk. I think that's the other thing is they had a really good 3 in Tuitt, Hayward, and Hargrave there for a few years where remember that dominant 2019 defense? It was those 3 guys up front, and you wonder why they were so good. But because Tuitt retired a year after Hargrave was gone, you lose both Hargrave and Tuitt, and boom, you have a massive hole in the defensive line. So it matters a ton. I mean, it matters a ton. Larry Ogunjobi was a good signing, but just probably hasn't been the same since he had that foot injury with the Bengals at the end of his tenure there. The explosiveness never fully came back. So you need a guy that can come in there and be that game wrecker. I mean, it's Cam Hayward right now on one side. Keanu Benton is still kind of – I think he's out of position. I think he's a 3-5 more than a nose.
Same. I agree.
I think he's a really good pass rusher, learning how to be a run defender right now. I like what Keanu Benton does, but they need a wrecker, man. Like they need a difference maker. And so it matters a ton. for the Steelers scheme in particular, where you are so heavily reliant on rushing four like the Steelers do, it is so huge to have that interior D lineman. And so that matters a ton. You wonder why, there's a reason, Chris, I feel like you and me, when we've talked about this stuff, have been saying defensive line is so important for the Steelers this year. Not only because of the run defense, but because the pass rush. I mean, that is a huge part of what makes the Steelers scheme work. If the front doesn't work, the Steelers scheme doesn't work. The linebackers are not built like, they're not James Ferrier and they're not Larry Foote, right? They're different. Patrick Queen and Peyton Wilson are built to be sideline to sideline speed linebackers. They're built for coverage. They're built for the drop 7 game. They're not as built for the downhill thumper. And so that makes defensive line even more important. And so, it matters a lot. So when you look at asset management, where you're signing Milton Williams, Tershawn Wharton is out there. There's a few really good players out there. Then you talk to the draft. We talk about Harmon, Grant, Nolan, and then later guys. You can talk about Williams and Walker and Caldwell and all these different players. There's so many good players, and so it matters a ton. And I think that's why it's a big focus this offseason for it.
No, I think so too. And it just gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where I said when you brought up Milton Williams, I wanted to save that for this segment because I talked about this with Ray Fittipaldo on the North Shore Drive podcast with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But when I look up, one thing that the Eagles did very well was they had a rotation of pass rushers. They had guys. Milton Williams was coming off the bench and bringing heat on passing downs, and that allowed the guys who were run stuffers to be run stuffers. Like Milton Williams, he's not overly big. He's 6'3", 290. Like, he's a fine size, but you look at what he was able to do on the season, and he got 5 sacks as a rotational, guy thrown in with the defense. And that's what I think that's what the Steelers have been missing is impact from those types of players. Montrevious Adams has been fine, but like guys like Isaiah Loudermilk, they never panned out into being those types of guys. That's why I also think, between Williams, like honestly, you said the other name I was looking at. There's 2 guys particularly I'm looking at as free agent defensive tackle potential grabs: Tershawn Wharton and Milton Williams, because either one of those guys, Williams had 5 sacks last year. Tershawn Wharton had 6.5. They're both 27. Well, I think Williams is actually 26, but he's going to be 26. Wharton's going to be 27. They're getting ready for the primes of their career as defensive linemen. Those are guys that can be rotational guys fit in. I love the way Wharton played the run for the Chiefs in the Super Bowl and the way he was constantly making plays to keep Saquon Barkley in check. You add those guys in free agency for not a ton of money, and that's the question that I don't know yet is, how much money will they command in the free agent market? Will it be like breaking the bank to get them, or they'll be like still solid veteran signings? But if you added those guys to your D-line and then drafted a Kenneth Grant, that's all you need, in my opinion, because then all of a sudden you got Cam Hayward, you got Grant, you got, or name a rookie that's drafted really high. You've got Benton, and then you've got those 2 free agents, and then you can get a cheap guy there. And then I think you have a rotation that can be dominant, that can be a big part of that defense. And then that's not a question anymore. And when the Steelers defensive front is playing that much better, it's going to free things up more for TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, and Nick Herbig, and as well as the linebackers. And then the secondary can also be a lot more aggressive as well.
Yeah, that's the dream. And the Eagles, have Moro Jomo waiting in the wings, who's just going to be an absolute breakout stud. The depth of their D-line is absolutely insane. And the Steelers need to get that depth. And that comes through I think, they're not going to be able to sign both those guys, but they're going to be able to sign one of them. There are even guys like down the board this year, in my opinion, that are interesting free agents.
Aeneas, I think you're going to talk about the draft class. I was saying Aeneas Peebles. I love that. I love that guy.
He's a really fun player. But I can even look at, the defensive line free agents this year, and I feel like there's a lot more depth maybe than people are going to give it credit for. BJ Hill, nice player.
Yeah.
DJ Jones, nice player. Menahue, good player. There's a lot of players in this. Sebastian Joseph Day, if you want a nose plugger, like there's guys that are in this class, free agents that are good. And so I think that in particular really adds intrigue to me to the free agency crop, because I think you pair that, we talked about corner. I feel like that's going to be a big free agency addition. You get the D-line and corner figured out. What is the weakness on the defense? Like, I don't know. You scheme-proof it almost.
Yeah.
And That's the thing. So I think signing one of those guys is good. I also really like, the idea. I know it was reported, I think, way back when. I think actually John Lynch said that they were going to cut Javon Hargrave. I
Yep.
think that's an interesting idea. He's not what he once was, but he's still a good player. And him as a rotational piece that's not going to break the bank. I mean, that's the type of signing you make on the edges. When I look at the Eagles, I look at their signings of guys like Zach Bond and Mekhi Becton as the type of signings the Steelers need to make this offseason if they want to elevate their team, right? I think Mekhi Becton got like $4 million. Bond got, I think, $2 million.
Yep.
The Steelers need a lot more Deshaun Elliott signings, and they can find those. I think there's value to be had here, both on the defensive line and corner, but defensive line especially, and with how deep the defensive line is. I've been coming around to this in the first 4 rounds. If I were the Steelers, I'd be very much interested in double dipping in this defensive line class.
We've been talking about that. Yep.
I really think that they're going to have the ability to do that. Your first 3 rounds, probably 2 D linemen and a receiver, and then a running back in round 4. It makes sense to me if you can fix corner and free agency. And so I really love the idea of double dipping in this class. And so there are so many options for them. Paying for a defensive lineman plus drafting them, building up the D line, getting dominant in the trenches on both sides of the ball. Hopefully you get that extra year of progression from Broderick Jones, Troy Fautanu, Zach Frazier, McCormick to make the O-line start to really take a step too. And everything should be coming together. If the Steelers can become a team that dominates up front, even if they have weaknesses around them, they can be a team that can be feared.
Absolutely. Nick, thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let people can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Yeah, you guys can follow me on X, Twitter at Farabaugh Make sure to read stuff over at penlive.com. Got great stuff coming there. Combine next week. That'll be fun. And then also make sure to check out the YouTube channel, Steelers on Penn Live.
Absolutely. He's Nick Farabaugh. I'm Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, all the social media. Same handle everywhere, at Carter Critiques. Read my work here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every Monday through Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your Monday through Friday episodes. Back here tomorrow with more on your Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.